This lecture is about water and large biological molecules. Remember from last lecture, oops, let's go back one, it's being funny. Remember from last lecture, we talked about water as being made from oxygen and hydrogen, and that oxygen was an electronegative atom in that it pulled electrons towards itself, and it results in water being a polar molecule, a molecule that's got slightly negative side and slightly positive side. Well, this feature of water sets up some of its important properties. The first is that water is a polar solvent. A solution is when you've got a liquid that's got two or more substances and they're evenly mixed. The dissolving agent is called the solvent, and the substance that's dissolved in it is called the solute. Because it is polar, water can dissolve ionic substances, things like salts. In this picture, you can see a sodium atom, and well, I shouldn't call it an atom, a sodium ion, a cation, positively charged. What happens is that positively charged molecule gets surrounded by water molecules, and the water molecules orient themselves so that their slightly negative side is pointing towards the positively charged ion. So water can dissolve other compounds that have got charges. It can't dissolve things that do not have charges. So non-polar substances, things like oil, cannot dissolve in water. Another couple of properties of water that are quite important are cohesion, adhesion. Co means together. So cohesion means water molecules stick to each other. Cohesion results in some important properties, such as the movement of water from the root of a plant all the way up to the leaf. Adhesion is when water molecules stick to other molecules. So for example, if you spill water on your countertop and you use a paper towel, the water climbs into that paper towel by adhering to those other molecules. And that adhesion happens as a result of the hydrogen bonds. Water has some really weird properties compared to other compounds. Typically, if you compare liquid, solid, and gas states for any compound, the gaseous state has the least density and the solid state has the most density. So if you put the solid into the liquid of that compound, the solid would sink. However, in water, because of the hydrogen bonds that form between water molecules, as water cools down into its solid state, it actually forces the molecules a little bit apart because of those hydrogen bonds, and it forms a crystal structure. That crystal structure has more space between the molecules in the solid crystal than in the liquid water. And as a result, solid water is less dense than liquid water, and ice floats. This might seem to you to be something that is irrelevant, but just think for a second what would happen if every single winter, when it got cold enough that water froze, that frozen water sank down to the bottom of the oceans or the bottom of the lakes. Before too long, those lakes would be frozen solid and there would be no living organisms within it. That doesn't happen. In fact, what happens is you get a layer of ice on the surface of the water, and underneath the water you have cold but liquid water that living organisms can stay in. So that's quite important. Chemical reactions are when you break down bonds between two atoms and you reform new ones. So these are going to be important for us because living organisms have chemical reactions going on inside of their cells. So we have a couple of terms that I need to introduce. Reactants are the starting ingredients, and the products are what you get as a result of the chemical reaction. So in the illustration you've got here, you have two hydrogen gas molecules and an oxygen gas molecule. The bonds between the hydrogens break and the bonds between the oxygens break, and you get reforming of new bonds between oxygen and hydrogen to form two water molecules. The reactants were hydrogen and oxygen. The product is water. Carbon chemistry is really cool. It turns out that as a result of the fact that living organisms are carbon-based life, we have these building blocks that have got a huge variety of three-dimensional shapes that can arise just by simple combinations. I like to think about these as Lego blocks that have got 4 sticky bits on them. That's your classic piece of carbon. So carbon's got 4 electrons in its outer shell, and it can share its electrons with other atoms to form 4 covalent bonds. So you could have a carbon stuck with another carbon, 2 carbons in a row, or you could have 3 carbons in a row, or 10. Carbon skeletons can be very variable in their length. You could also have a carbon skeleton that's straight, or you could have branches to it. You can have double bonds. Double bonds are interesting because what they do is they create a kink in the carbon skeleton. So instead of it being a straight skeleton, it has a kink on it. And you can have double bonds in different locations in your carbon skeleton. And if the carbon skeleton is long enough, it can actually wrap around back on itself and form ring structures. So these carbon molecules in living organisms can be enormous. For example, in each one of the cells in your body, the DNA, if you lift it up end to end, all the pieces of DNA, the molecule would be about 2 meters long. So that's about 2.5 yards. All living organisms are made up out of these 4 important biological molecules, major categories. We have carbohydrates, we've got lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Carbohydrate means carbon with water. These are sugars or saccharides, and they're important for short-term energy sources and structure. Lipids are non-polar. They're the fats and the waxes and oils. We use those for long-term energy storage, and they have some structural components to them as well. Proteins are made up out of amino acids. Some are structural, but they have very diverse functions in the body. And then we have nucleic acids, which are including our deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA, and ribonucleic acid, or RNA. This carries genetic information and assists with chemical reactions. So I want you to pay attention to some of the details of each of these 4 large biological molecules. One of the trends that you'll see in the story is that many large biological molecules are made up out of repeating units. The repeating units are called monomers. Monomers are just small building blocks. They join together to form polymers, or large structures. So when you look at a large biological molecule, a question to ask is, what is the monomer and what is a polymer? In the carbohydrates, the monomers are often called sugars, and one way to identify them is that the name ends with OSE: glucose, fructose, galactose. With sugars, many of the sugars that you know, in fact the one that you probably put in your tea, is sucrose. And that's actually not a monomer, it's a dimer. It's got 2 monomers glued together. So table sugar, or sucrose, has got glucose and fructose joined together. Lactose, the milk that you get in sugar, the sugar you get in milk, is made of glucose and galactose. Some people don't have an enzyme to break down the lactose into glucose and galactose. And so when they drink milk, that lactose sugar passes through to their bowels, and in their bowels, they happen to have bacteria that can do it. As a result, they get a lot of indigestion. Maltose is a sugar that comes from barley, and that's the beer sugar that's broken down by yeast, and that's glucose with glucose. The 3 polymers that I'd like you to learn are starch, glycogen, and cellulose. Starch is a polymer made of glucose monomers that are joined together, and is what plants use for their energy storage. So if you eat a potato, you're eating a lot of starch, and it's got lots of glucose monomers within it. And that will make sense to you when you hear dietitians suggesting that people with diabetes avoid eating things like potato because of the high amounts of starch their body can then use to make sugar and elevate their blood sugar. Glycogen is how animals store their energy. So you don't have to eat every moment of the day. And part of the reason for that is once you've eaten, your body fills your liver and your muscles up with glycogen. So it takes glucose and it converts it into glycogen and stores it there. If you eat more carbohydrate than your body actually needs to store, excess carbohydrates will be converted into fat and then stored. So it's important to make sure you fill up your glycogen stores, but you don't overfill them. Cellulose is also made out of glucose, but the way in which the glucose bonds to each other in cellulose is different than in starch and in glycogen. And as a result, humans can't break down cellulose. Plants use cellulose as a structural compound in their cell walls to give them stiffness. So think of it like a cardboard box. In fact, cardboard boxes are made of cellulose. But if you try to eat a cardboard box, you couldn't get the glucose out of it because your body doesn't have the enzymes to digest that particular type of connection between those monomers. And so your body would flush out that extra cellulose. We call it fiber. So make sure you get plenty of fiber, but just don't eat cardboard boxes. Lipids are your second category of large biological molecule. They're composed of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen, and they don't dissolve in water. There are three categories. The first is called triglycerides. When you go to get your blood work done at the doctor's, one of the measures that they'll do is they'll look at your triglycerides. It gives an idea of whether you're overeating or not. Triglycerides have a structure where they are three fatty acid monomers that are connected to a glycerol molecule, and they're used in your body for storage. Phospholipids are fatty acids which are connected to a phosphate group, and those are the constituents of your cell membrane. Every living organism's cell membrane is made with phospholipids. Sterols include cholesterol. Cholesterol can be eaten in your food, but you can also make it. Your body has its own way to synthesize cholesterol. It's extremely important in creating hormones in your body. So testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone are all derived from cholesterol, which is one of the reasons why if you have too low levels of body fat, so for men, if your body fat level I think is below like 13%, and if you're female, your body fat percentage is lower than 18%, you're likely to start having hormonal issues. A lot of female athletes who have extremely low body fat levels often end up losing their monthly cycles because they simply can't make sufficient quantities of hormones in order to have those cycles. Proteins are so cool. This group of large biological molecules has got nitrogen in addition to the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The monomers are called amino acids, and there are 20 naturally occurring amino acids. Of those, about 9, or depending on if you're a kid or not, but 9 or 10 of them are considered essential amino acids, and you have to eat those in food. You can't synthesize those ones. The rest of the amino acids your body can actually synthesize and make them. The polymers are called polypeptides. So if you take a strand of amino acids and you link them together, it's called a polypeptide. That primary structure, that amino acid sequence, can then get folded in a variety of different shapes. Some of them are things called alpha helices or beta sheets, and it can form secondary structure. Those secondary structures can then get folded again to form a tertiary structure. Those tertiary structures can form quaternary structures. I just want you to imagine a very long string of beads that gets wound and wound and wound until you've got a three-dimensional ball. And that three-dimensional structure has function. And the specific function of a protein depends on its shape, and its shape depends on that primary sequence. So if you get the wrong sequence, you'll completely change the quaternary structure and you'll have the wrong thing. Proteins have many functions. Turns out your body doesn't store protein very well. You should eat a high quality protein source at least every other day. You can store energy in the form of fat. You can store sugar and glucose as glycogen and fat. You really can't store protein. And its functions include structural functions. In your skin, you've got collagen and elastin, and they give your skin that flexibility and spring. When you start losing your collagen and elastin, you get wrinkly. Your muscles are made out of specific proteins called actin and myosin that can contract. In your blood, you have a protein called hemoglobin that bonds with oxygen and it helps to transport oxygen around your body. Antibodies are proteins that are formed in response to the presence of antigens or small molecules from pathogens in your body. And enzymes that you use to digest food and to run all of the chemical reactions in your body are also made from protein. So lipase, helicase. Notice ASE means enzymes. Every single chemical reaction in your entire body is modulated by its very own enzyme. So there are very, very many enzymes, and each enzyme has its own unique primary structure, its own unique amino acid sequence. Nucleic acids are data storage molecules and chemical machines. DNA is found in all of your cells, and it stores information on how to make proteins. You get one copy of DNA from your mother and one from your father. So you have two copies of all of the recipes. Sometimes your body uses your mom's copy, sometimes it uses your dad's copy, and sometimes their copies are identical, and so it doesn't really matter. The chemical machines are large strands of nucleic acids that have functions for the making of proteins. We've got tRNA, which is transfer RNA, rRNA, which is ribosomal RNA. But in all of these cases, the monomers for nucleic acids are called nucleotides, and the monomers can include adenine, guanine, thymine, cytosine, and uracil. In RNA, there are 4 nucleic acids, cytosine, guanine, adenine, and uracil, whereas in DNA, there are cytosine, guanine, adenine, and thymine. So thymine and uracil are each unique to their own ribonucleic acid. The polymers can be called DNA or RNA. We'll get into more detail later when we go over the structure of RNA and DNA and how it's used in the body. I just want to show you a little bit more of a detail, 2 of the important chemical machines. Transport RNA brings amino acids into the right place to generate proteins when you're making proteins and reading the signal from messenger RNA. And ribosomal RNA is a chemical machine that's involved in a process called translation, which is the generation